most people see tragedy. We see the glory of God. And this is why the symbol of death and humiliation, the cross, became so central to Christianity. It was almost like, back then is probably like a Babylon Bee meme. It was a parody.
Right.
Why do you have a symbol of death that brings hope and inspiration? Because it's the power over death,
right.
Kind of a thing. So.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Salty Pastor Podcast, a podcast dedicated to helping you learn and grow in your faith. It is a journey that you must go on. It is not something you can opt out of. It's not something you can run away from. I guess you can run away from it, but you'll be shrinking in your faith whether you believe that you have it or not. And we want you to be growing in your faith. We want you to be taking purposeful steps every day towards growing your faith and understanding what you believe and why you believe it. And we want to be part of that here at the Salty Pastor Podcast. My name is Jesse Maher. I'll be your host, but we cannot do the Salty Pastor Podcast without the Salty Pastor himself, Dr. Douglas Peake.
Hey, it's good to be with you, everybody. I'm really excited about what we're focusing on right now, and that is the glory, the power and the glory of God, and the resurrection of Christ, and why we celebrate it every year, and we always return to it, is because we have to know and understand that our faith is rooted in power. It's incredible power, and we have to understand that and know that so that we don't go through life living powerless, right? Because we've been deceived into thinking we're powerless. And so that's why I love resurrection celebration, sometimes called Easter, because what it does is it's a time every year that we take out and say, we're going to remember the real foundation of our faith, and that is the power of God over death and sin.
Absolutely. And for these 3 weeks, we're really going to be focused on that most important event in Christianity, which is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. None of the Christmas story matters if he doesn't die, right? Like him being
correct.
Here, it doesn't matter unless he dies and resurrects. And so this is the peak point of it. And there's plenty of people that even admit that Jesus lived, right? Like,
yes.
But they don't believe in what he did for us, and that's
correct.
the thing.
Correct.
On Tuesday, you talked about 1 Corinthians 15. Paul was talking about if we don't rise from the dead, our faith is in vain. If Christ did not rise from the dead, our faith is in vain. And the point and purpose of the resurrection is all about power and authority. Not only was Jesus a real person, which we talked about, but his resurrection from the dead showed that he was God. It proves that he's now has the power over death. And it was in this demonstration of power that it's necessary for us to celebrate, which always sounds weird, right? We're celebrating that he died. It's always this weird paradox in your brain. You're going, why would you do that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think that really drives home how God, Paul says in Corinthians that God takes the wisdom of this world, turns it upside down, right? And I think that God already knew, and this is what's really important. God already knew that he had power over death, right? He wasn't locked in space-time continuum as the creator of the universe, right? So he already knew that he had power over death, and then it was human beings, you and me, that needed to see it and notice it and be inspired and changed and transformed by it. That's why we have hope. Most people see tragedy. We see the glory of God. And this is why the symbol of death and humiliation, the cross, became so central to Christianity. It was almost like, back then is probably like a Babylon Bee meme. It was a parody.
Right.
Why do you have a symbol of death that brings hope and inspiration? Because it's the power over death,
right?
Kind of a thing. So.
Well, on Tuesday, we dug into the implications of the demonstration of this power, how it's the power that gives us hope, strength, and muscles in our faith. And it's this power that allow us to heal a hole that we have in us, right? It's this power that allows us to persevere through evil atrocities in this world. It's his power that allows us to be committed to justice in this world around us, even though it's full of injustice. And then we dug into how Jesus manifested this power when he calmed the seas. Why is it so important for us to recognize and know the power of Jesus in today's world, Pastor?
Well, I think we're just going to continue to face more and more evil. I don't think people realize historically that, the last two generations of Americans have really lived without, in essence, war. There's really been almost no war on American soil per se since the Civil War.
Yeah.
And, World War I and World War II were massive wars, but they weren't on our own soil,
Yeah,
per se.
other than like a single incident.
Yeah, like at Pearl Harbor.
And then 9/11, same thing. It was like, and that's why we take those things so seriously here in America, right? It's because we don't experience that. That's stuff that happens in other countries
all the
fairly
time.
regularly, but we make whole days and memorials out of it because we're like, this doesn't happen in America.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's really interesting is because of that, we are shocked now about the evil that's rising up in our culture all over the place, and we don't know necessarily how to deal with it. I don't know if people are aware, but on Monday, a transgendered individual broke into a Christian school. It was a school that was secured. You can't get in, but this person came up and then shot the doors out. They were all glass doors. Shot the doors out, and then came in and murdered 6-7 people, a number of them young children, little girls that were just murdered. And what I think is really interesting about this situation is how our politicians and media have responded in various ways. It's just indicative of what we as Christians are facing and why the issue of power is so important for our faith and for our hope. First, there's this anti-gun reflex in media and society. It's like the first thing is that, we have to, there's this reflex. It's all guns' fault. Of course, it was guns that took out the perpetrator and stopped their rampage of killing more people, right? So I think that's just really disingenuous. But second and most insightful in the situation is the fact that these children, were murdered, but the media is saying that they deserved to die because they were Christians.
Really?
Yeah, it's really quite fascinating. The media is claiming that it was Christians and their hateful rhetoric that caused this person to want to come and murder them. And, I want to be clear about that. It's just pure, unadulterated evil of what happened and what's continuing to happen. And I just don't see any... this shows you how evil works, okay? Basically, it's this radical gender ideology that's been introduced into our schools and in our media. Therefore, it is our society that now creates all of this mental illness in these people who do these things, right? Then they point fingers at Christians for saying, look, this ideology is destroying people, right? And then they say, well, that's hateful rhetoric. And so what a lot of people don't realize is that so much of what's been going on in these mass shootings are from people who are struggling with this mental illness, right? In November 2022, a non-binary identifying suspect, Anderson Aldrich, carried out the deadly mass shooting at a gay nightclub. Okay, you kind of go on. Let me read a few more for you. In 2019, it was a female to male transgendered person that went into the School Highlands Ranch in Douglas County and killed a bunch of people that they said were transphobic. In September of 2018, a female to male identifying trans shooter named Snokia Mosley murdered 3 colleagues at a Rite Aid distribution center in Aberdeen, Maryland. If you go back and you start looking at mass shootings, the common thread in this is not the gun, it's the mental illness. And the primary mental illness that most of these mass shootings that have been struggling with, or that we have seen in the last 5 to 10 years, has to do around this radical gender ideology. And so what I'm postulating is that the media is now saying that Christians point out that there's a crazy ideology out there being propagated in our schools, and the media is saying because Christians point that out, they deserve to be murdered. You know, I was talking to my 17-year-old this morning, and it was just interesting his perspective. He says people on Instagram and social media are going around saying that, you know, this person suffered discrimination, and so they went and murdered people, as if that's some justification to go and murder children. He goes, I just don't get it. I think that it's really pretty significant to see what the media is trying to do in this regards. And I think that's indicative of the fact that we as Christians are going to suffer and be persecuted more when people go into a Christian school and then the media immediately says, well, it's your fault for being transphobic. That's why you got murdered. I mean, that just seems really crazy to me. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think ultimately what we're seeing is, like you said, this idea that there's so much mental illness going around, whether it's around transgenderism or other, because I mean, there are not, you know, there's been mass shootings from various perpetrators, but they all suffer from some sort of mental illness. You have to have some sort of mental illness to be like, I'm going to go shoot children. Like, you have to be sick. And we have seen an uptick in mental illness the more we've pushed these ideologies and started saying, oh, well, you need to feel your feelings and your truth is your truth and your whatever. So whether it's transgender or not, the mental illness rate has gone up in the last however many years. And it's not out of lack of the culture, quote unquote, trying to fix it, right? The media says, oh, we're doing all these things to help people get over their mental illness. And it's like, well, what's causing the rise in mental illness in the first place? Because all of your progressive activist things we're supposed to help these people, and yet we're seeing an uptick in it, and we're seeing an uptick in the amount of shootings and the amount of mental illness. So it's like, I don't understand how the media is really successfully spinning this, because if you critically think about it, you're like, but wait, all of these supposed things that we're doing to fix this have not fixed it. They've in fact made it worse. So whether it's a trans shooting or something else, we're seeing mental illness uptick at a rapid rate because the culture's causing mental illness. It's right there in front of you, right?
Right, yeah. And I think, you know, the evidence is pointing in the direction. This is the point of Salty Pastors. You have to make up your own mind. You have to think for yourself, and I would hope that you critically think through this, but the evidence is starting to point to the fact that it's our public education system and our universities and a lot of these ideologies. And we kind of focus on what I call the downstream effect of these ideologies. For instance, the ideologies around gender dysphoria or transgenderism, the ideologies of feminism, the ideologies of these things. But what people don't really realize is that they're really coming from the upstream value of it's basic Marxism, where everybody's putting a class or a segment, and then, you know, what they're doing is justifiable because of the rage that they feel from their oppression. And that's what it's coming in here is like, you know, there's a guy, he is a sports writer. His name is Mike Wise. And he basically says, you know, he supports what Kat Marco tweets out. It says, I don't contain this person's actions, though I understand their outrage against an intolerant state that brainwashes children through religious indoctrination. Right? And so this guy is a big sports writer, and he agrees with it, okay? Progressive talk show host David Pakman mocked the Christian school for not praying enough. He said, well, these things happen because you don't pray enough, right? Because whenever these things happen, we basically say, well, let's pray for people.
Right. And what's wild to me is the fact that these people are justifying, oh, well, they're Christian kids, so this is okay. There's no outrage that the fact that these kids were killed. If we at any point had gone, I mean, we as Christians had gone, oh, well, the gay nightclub, those people deserved it. Churches would be in flames across America, right? But
right.
you can broadcast this idea across national television of, well, they should have been praying more or whatever. Yeah. Like, even that statement, like, what? How is that even remotely logical that kids died and you're making a mockery of it? And at and using this religious context for it too, which if any other group would do that to any other group, it would be outraged as canceled and they're bigots and they're doing all these things. But no, it's fine because, they're Christians, so we can do whatever we want.
Yeah, I mean, it just goes on and on. I mean, activist Shannon Watts runs a big activist organization called Moms Demanding Action. She says if prayers alone worked, there wouldn't be a mass shooting at a school where they pray. So she's ridiculing it. Television show writer Lee Aronson scoffed at it, and he's tweeted. ABC News journalist Terry Moran is accused of blaming Christians and Republicans after he highlighted how Tennessee banned transgendered medical care for minors, and this is why this shooting took place, as if, well, it's justifiable to kill children because Tennessee said it's wrong to mutilate children when they're minors. Right? Another big lie that's coming out of this over and over and over again, it was even propagated by our president, is this lie that the number one cause of death among children is now gun violence. Well, that's just a lie. The CDC, when you look at the stats, it says there were 5,400 deaths of children to gun violence, and there were like 5,200 deaths for car crashes, right? Because vehicular deaths is really the main cause of children dying. And what was really interesting is that in order for the CDC to do that, you know what they did? They included children between the ages of 0 or birth to 19. So they included 18 and 19-year-olds, which are not children. Those are considered adults in America. But that's the only way you could get the stats of death. So people who are serving in the Army, if they get killed or whatever, because it's mostly enlisted people who are what? 18 and 19 years old, right? So it's really fascinating to me that statistic in and of itself is a false narrative to try to get people to buy into it. But the issue here today for me is not saying guns. I mean, look, there's a lot of Christian people that follow Jesus that are like anti-gun. They don't like guns. That's fine. That's a great expression of your faith. There's a lot of people who are pro-gun. I think the issue, though, is that if you're going to be an honest person, you have to think critically. And you have to realize that when you basically take 0 to 17 years of age, the number one thing, a cause of death, is vehicle deaths, right? From car crashes.
Yeah.
And if you really want to say children, because they say this, children, in our society, we think children are people who are 0 to about 12 or 13 years of age. When you're 14, 15, 16, 17, you're considered a semi-adult. You're like a young adult. You're not full adult at 18, but you're learning how to drive, you're making a lot of decisions. So if you really want to be honest, you'd have to say 0 to 13. And when you look at gun violence or gun deaths amongst those kids, it drops way, way, way down the list. Kids are dying of cancers and alcohol-related vehicular deaths and things like that at a much higher rate. So the point being is that we have to take into account that society is going in a certain direction for a reason and a purpose, right? And we have to say that, look, it's all of this mass shootings over the last 20 years have all been a result of what? Mental illness. So a lot of it is revolving. A lot of the mental illness shooters have non-binary or gender mental issues, which, by the way, are always packaged. I remember listening to a psychiatrist talk one time. He goes, pathogens are seldom alone. They travel in pairs and three's company. And what's his point? Is that, well, if you have one mental disorder like gender dysphoria or body dysmorphia or something like that, then there's usually there's two or three other things.
They all stack up and can start influencing other aspects. Like you're probably experiencing depression.
Yes.
Because of
severe depression.
Stuff like that. Yeah. Which totally makes sense.
Dissociated behavior. I mean, all these other types of things. You're right. They're getting into all of this. So it's fascinating to me me how so much over the last 20 years, more than half, almost half of these shooters, people committing these acts of violence, were dealing with this pathogen as well as others. Isn't that interesting to me? It just seems like it's almost an explosion of it.
Yeah, I mean, just the amount of mental health problems, like we said, are just out of control these days, and they could be related to gender identity. They could be related to the side effects of gender identity. All of these different things that are coming in, and what their perceived truth is causing them to believe that, oh, it's justifiable to go in and murder all of these children. And so, society's not giving them any kind of, they want to jump on the gun wagon. And usually there's a thing of like, well, we need to get more mental health stuff, but nothing ever happens. Right. And they're not ultimately addressing the root cause, which is the culture has started putting these kids and these adults at risk with what it's saying you should and shouldn't believe. And so mental health services can only
aren't helping.
They're only going to treat the symptoms, right? Like there's no talk about, well, what's causing all of the root issues.
What if our mental health services are causing the problem?
Okay.
See, that's a thing nobody wants to talk about. And you know, I people who listen to the Salty Pastor are saying, give us research, give us information so we can make up our own minds. When you were gone, I talked about the Pritzker family. They're billionaires, and they're propagating what is called SSIs. And what it is it's a synthetic sexual identities. And the point is that we are not a dimorphic species. And that is, you have a male and a female means dimorphic.
Right. Yes.
You have a male and a female. And the only way we
don't have that.
We don't have that. It's all on a spectrum, which of course is pretty crazy stuff. But the Pritzker family, which are billionaires, have heavily invested into this, billions of dollars. And one of the things that they're doing is they're going around to medical communities, right? Medical universities, research hospitals. They're coming in and say, we'll give you 30, 50, $100 million. I mean, that is a boatload of money.
Yeah.
And we want you to start a gender clinic here. And so since 2014, there were almost 0 gender clinics in the United States. That was 9 years ago. And now there are hundreds of them. It has been an absolute explosion since 2014. You look also about BlackRock. A lot of people don't know that BlackRock, which has trillions of dollars of investments, in other words, massive teacher union pension funds, massive corporate pension stuff, gave it to BlackRock, and then they invest it on their behalf. Well, what people are just realizing now that BlackRock is a very woke investment firm, and they're pushing a lot of these radical things. A lot of people don't know that they invested almost $1 billion, just shy of $1 billion, in Authentic Brands. Well, what is Authentic Brands? Well, Authentic Brands is a corporation that owns Sports Illustrated. And do you know that in the last 3 years, there have been 4 transgendered athletes on the cover of Sports Illustrated? If that's not a propaganda push, then what is? I mean, the biggest one was the swimmer, right? And now finally the gal that swam against him all the time, Riley Gaines, is going out there and saying, this is ridiculous. This guy was walking around naked in the female locker room before swimming, and he is anatomically 100% a male. So he hasn't had any surgeries or anything at all. And BlackRock is invested in that. You take the Pritzker family, as I said earlier, who are funding these gender clinics on hospitals all across the land. A big one just recently that came to light is the gender clinic at Vanderbilt, right? At Vanderbilt University Medical Center. And that got shut down because they were operating on 12 and 13-year-old girls, you know? Then you look at what is called the media and big pharma. A lot of people don't know this, but all of these things are coming together, is that you have these media companies, right, that are conglomerates that have invested billions of dollars in big pharma. A lot of people were saying, how in the world can you get a vaccine for COVID out so fast and then silence all the people who had questions about it. Okay? How could you do that so fast? Well, that's because big pharma and media companies are conglomerates that are all invested in one another. Here, a lot of people don't know who Condé Nast is, but Condé Nast is a company that owns Vogue, Wired, Allure, Ars Technica, Bon Appetit, Johansson's, The Traveler, Epicurious, Glamour, GQ, House and Garden, Le Cucina Italiana, Self, Vanity Fair, Teen Vogue, Them, The New Yorker. I'm naming off massive magazines that have a huge cultural influence. Wired, which is a technical kind of a music thing. Well, guess what? Condé Nast started and invested in a massive pharma company, right? And in 2010, it was going bankrupt. Then it got involved in gender transitions. And by 2020, it has $2 billion in assets. So it went from $0 to $2 billion. And its primary market has been gender transition. And see, a lot of people don't know this. So you have this exploding market, right? You have medical communities, big pharma in league with media companies. Now, you make up your own mind. Is there a conspiracy? I don't know, but it certainly seems to me like a massive conflict of interest.
Absolutely.
You know? Then you got the Arcus Foundation. A lot of people have no idea what that is. I didn't know what it is, so I went and I'm reading. It is the largest LGBT non-government organization, okay, in the world. And it's invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in none other than the American Psychological Foundation. All right. And the American Psychological Association, the American Psychological Foundation, is the one that says that masculinity is what? Toxic. They're the ones who actually published that research that we talked about during Desperado. What's interesting is they're putting hundreds of thousands of dollars into these organizations, these nonprofits, and then you have things like this. There is just recently there was an article in the Idaho Statesman. It came out yesterday, and it's 4 college students: Ari Garabedian, Ian Holland, Marisabel Reinhardt, and Sarah Miati. They are first and second year medical students at the University of Washington in the Idaho-Wawami regional program. And if you're not familiar with how it works in Idaho, is Idaho does not have its own medical school. And so what it's done is it has a Wawami program that stands for something. But basically what it is they partner with the University of Washington and with Utah Medical Center down in Utah, and they have to give a certain number of spots to Idaho applicants.
Okay.
So basically what it is, instead of us spending the money to open up our own, we buy space at University of Washington, UW Medical Center, and down at the University of Utah Medical Center. Okay. So we buy spaces. And so they go, okay, we'll just do that. Well, what's really interesting is these people, what they don't tell you is this program is in Moscow, Idaho, right? Mm-hmm. And they lead a service learning advocacy group. So these people are advocates. They're not studying to be doctors, which is science-based. They're studying to be advocates. And they want to use science. They want to use the medical field to provide advocacy for their stuff. And what they do is they said in their article that the American Psychological Association, the one that the Arcus Foundation has invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in, supports the notion of minor, there's minor gender affirming care. And they use these great acronyms and statements, but what they're talking about is they're saying if you're a 14-year-old girl and you feel like a boy, then not only will we give you puberty blockers, but you know what else we'll do is we will remove your breasts. So the reason why minors are called minors in our judicial system is because they're not old enough or wise enough to give consent. That's the whole point. You're a minor. You can't give consent. You can't, if you're 12 or 13, you can't give consent to sexual activity with adult because you don't understand the implications
Right.
of that, right? You can't give consent to take drugs, right? Like, if there's, and even in states where like marijuana is legal, or alcohol is legal, a minor can't drink alcohol, right?
Right.
Because they don't understand what the implications of it.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
And yet these 4 college students wrote an op-ed in the Idaho Statesman that they printed demanding that Governor Little veto a bill in the Idaho State Senate that just passed. It's sitting on his desk as we speak, that just basically says you cannot give puberty blockers, which is chemical castration. You cannot do surgery on minors. Now, when they're 18, they can make whatever decision they want, but not when they're minors, okay? And these people are writing this, and what they do is they quote these medical organizations to say that these are scientific organizations that support their conclusions. But what they don't tell you in this article is there is not a single longitudinal study, not a single one, that says gender affirming care increases the mental health of people struggling with this mental illness over a 10, 15, and 20-year period. The only studies out there chart what happens within the first year to 2 years after their transition or after their surgery. That's it. There's no longitudinal studies. And what now they're finding is that if you take a 17-year-old and you transition them and send them through surgery, for the next couple of years, they're really, really happy. Then they get into their mid-20s and they go, wait a second. And now those people are detransitioning and they are suing. And so, I hope they all win. I mean, I could just go on and on. I don't want to get into too many weeds. What I'm trying to point out is this, is that the society in which we live is highly funded, highly organized to propagate this ideology, and they want your kids to be inculcated in it. And as a Christian, you look at what's going on and you see how more and more people are turning away from God. They're turning towards these things, and you think, man, our God is not in control. We don't have the power. But what you have to understand, what you're facing is massive, trillions of dollars, highly organized, and it all comes from the upstream things is Marxist ideology.
Well, Pastor, I kind of need you to round this out because this is not where I thought this conversation was going to go today. As far as, how do we as Christians celebrate the power of the resurrection when this whole thing is happening, like out in the world where we're seeing losses everywhere on the front of just people with more money?
Well, I think that it all comes down to this, and I felt it was important to address this situation that happened at this Christian school where these kids were murdered by evil, and it was evil being propagated. It was a person who was inculcated into this evil, right, through an ideology. And what we have to understand is that these are not natural movements. What we see happening in our society is not natural. It's intentional. And it's well-funded. It's highly organized. And I don't want to sound like an overt conspiracy theorist, but what I would say is that the conspiracy behind all evil is Satan. He is the great conspiracy. And the thing is that his conspiracy thought that he could win by killing Jesus, getting him rejected by the government, getting rejected by the power brokers, getting him rejected and killed by the lawyers and the religious leaders and the politicians and the government and everybody else, right? But what happened? It was Friday when he died, but Sunday's coming.
Sunday's coming.
And that's why when we look at these things and we see them as frightening, we have to remember it may feel like Friday, but never forget Sunday's coming.
Well, thank you, Pastor. I think that was, like I said, a little bit different than what we probably were expecting, but I think it's important to you're never one to shy away from the hard things. That's part of the reason you're the salty pastor, is because you're not
yes.
You're not one to shy away, and I think we do need to have these conversations. And do need to look at this through a clear lens and do need to critically think about things like this. So I love that final moment of it may feel like Friday, but Sunday's coming.
Sunday's coming.
Thank you guys so much for joining us. Make sure you join us on this Sunday for Palm Sunday here at Foothills, because we'll be kicking off our series, The Power and the Glory, and we'll see you then.
All right. Blessings.